Hey there, I'm Alan Furstenberg.
And I'm Mark Tucker. Welcome to Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Welcome back, folks.
Do we get to talk more multivocal today?
Oh, come on. You know me. I can't stop running my mouth about it. No, in all seriousness, yes. And in fact, what I really am looking forward to doing this week is taking all of the concepts that we talked about last week that I hope are kind of clear. And I hope people kind of ask some further questions about it and, clarify it. I hope I've clarified anything that wasn't too clear. And I really hope that what I'm going to show you this time really brings out, kind of illustrates some of those points, because I think what the CMS will let me do is really drive home some of these points.
All right, let me do my best giving a summary of what we talked about last week.
Okay.
And then you can fill in some missing parts. So multivocal in the end is a webhook that is going to handle processing of each of our conversation turns in a dialogue.
Specifically, it is a library for webhooks.
So it's a library for webhooks. So, okay, that makes sense. And in this framework, then every turn of a conversation, so every request to the service or to the webhook is going to go through this pipeline, which includes building up a configuration, figuring out which platform the request is coming in, doing a builder phase, which helps you identify which handler gets called. In the handlers, you're going to do different logic and figure out what output template's going to result. Then there's a response section that formats the output and sends it back to as the response. And then there's a post-process phase where you can do some logging or some other things.
That was beautifully stated, Mark. Thank you.
Oh, and if I remember right, then really the configuration is based on JSON. You can host it in Firestore, and the Multivocal CMS is a web front end for updating Firebase to dynamically change your configuration.
You got it.
All right, I'm ready to go.
That makes one of us. So what we're looking at here is the kind of the top level page for looking at a particular configuration and letting us edit that configuration. And this kind of illustrates the three major things that we want to be editing in Multivocal's configuration right now. The first and the most generic one are settings. And this is kind of just a basic JSON editor or a consistent JSON editor with a couple of extra bits to it. So I can define, for example, fields that I want to make sure get represented. And we'll talk about quickly what flex response is later. But I can also add or edit whatever fields or values that I feel are important. So if I wanted to add a field called hated color, I could do so. It's a string. And so now I've defined another field that I can use elsewhere. That's just in the configuration, which means it's in the environment, which means I can use it however I want later.
So what would be the path to that color, just so I understand? That's
actually a really good question. It would be setting, or it would be config, since it's loaded into the config, everything in here is loaded in the config. Right. It would be config, setting, special color.
Got it.
Since everything we're dealing in here is the configuration, I don't include the config part. That might make sense though to include. That's a good point. Levels we've already discussed briefly, but this is where it includes some level definitions. I've got some that are, hinted at by default. So the default ones are things that the system recommends that you set, so you can set them, and then you can add your own later. We'll look at that again in a second. The kind of real meat here are in the localized values. By default, it brings up the localized values for the undefined locale, which is kind of boring. But one of the things that this lets us do is I can say that by default, I'm going to have, if it doesn't match anything else, I can set up default responses that say, I seem to be a little bit confused.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good because that's kind of your catch-all for you forgot to implement any response. And while you're testing, if you suddenly hear, I seem to be a little bit confused, you know that you forgot to define something for that particular language. So that can be useful. In general, however,
and because it's undefined and because it's like this is like at the very bottom of the tree, then that will only happen in certain cases, but you've always got something to fall back on.
Right. And again, if you go back and look at that template path that we referred to before, it's going to be looking for locale first and then language and then undefined. And even then it's going to be looking for matching intents and matching actions and so forth before it gets this, an undefined default response is way down at the bottom of the list. We'll see though how even default responses can be useful in a couple of ways, right? When we look at here. So for example, my suffix only has one item defined for it, and it's a default one. The suffix is kind of usually meant to be used for prompting. So this basically says, if I don't define any more specific prompts, then you could either ask, what other color are you thinking about? Or tell me another color. So in just about any case, no matter what the user has said or done, if I'm going to be prompting them for something, this is the prompt I will use in English.
Right.
One of the other things I wanted to point out, and this was a feature that was kind of important to me, is that you can specify, you can see some of the different locales side by side.
Oh, that is handy.
So if I'm setting up responses for, let's say I'm doing it for both English and the US version of English, I might bring them up side by side so that I can then add them to the US one as I go along and look at exactly what the equivalent one in English is and see what I want to override. Or, look at the English one and bring up the French one. Or, similar things. So having them side by side, you can have up to 4 of them side by side.
Wow.
And it gets a little tight, but mostly I decided on 4 side by side because Andy got mad at me that I was only going to have 2. So I gave us 4.
That looks good. And if you got a big monitor,
for this though, we're going to mostly stick to just 1. And this is where, drilling down, we can see that we've got a bunch of possible responses listed, roughly in the order they will end up getting evaluated.
Okay.
So we have, a special outtent, color blue. So apparently if, we might set an outtent with the specific color that the user has talked about. And if it happens to be blue, then we've got a couple of different responses that are possible. So we might say, blue is my absolute favorite color, or I think there's something so striking about blue.
Okay.
But if they said some other color, let's say they said red, maybe I would also have an outtent color red, or an error bad color that's set based on that setting that we set elsewhere that might set something else. Or in general, though, if they've just triggered the action for a color and it didn't match blue, I might say, the color you mentioned is one of my favorite colors as well. Or, oh yes, green can be quite striking. And what it will do is it will pick one of these that's most appropriate. And it determines most appropriateness based on what I refer to as criteria. We'll look at criteria in a second. So it could filter out some of them because they don't meet the specific criteria of the time. A lot of what I'm showing here are just plain strings. So the easiest, most common thing that you'll do is you'll enter a string, and it uses this string as a markdown template. So if you enter in markdown here, it handles it as markdown. It will split it off into the text and XML versions as appropriate.
Okay.
But in some cases, you want to have something represented by markdown, and you want the text to be different. So you want to show something different than what you say.
Yep.
So you can then get into the nitty gritty by, instead of setting it as text, you can set a more detailed template. And this is where we have specific criteria. that can get set. So for example, under the specific condition that they have mentioned a color that is not their favorite color. So if this criteria evaluates as true, then this will also get included as one of the possible responses. All of them are still possible responses,
Right.
because there was no criteria that eliminated these, but there's criteria that includes this one. And in this case, we specifically say that the text and just the text is going to be, I don't know, I agree with you that this is nicer than this. And I can add markdown that would show something else or say something else as SSML.
Okay.
So I can have both the text and the markdown, or the text and the SSML listed here in my template. The template actually can contain anything, and it applies all of the values to it. So for example, if I had recommendation buttons, suggestion chips,
Yep.
I could put those suggestion chips either here or in the suffix as well.
Okay.
If I was, for example, setting a data object that would be passed to APL or AAPL, or a data object that would be passed to an interactive canvas, or an interactive canvas page that needed to be mentioned, I can mention them in the template as well. So anything I want goes into the template.
All right, that makes sense.
It's just the most common things are markdown, which is why if you just enter a string, it's just that's kind of the default.
Right.
Remember how you said, you wanted a way that if, the first time they said something that didn't make any sense, I'd say one thing, and then the second time I'd say something else.
Yeah.
So that would be, for example, an action unknown action, and with a level of 1, 2, or default.
Right.
So the first time it might say, I'm sorry, I didn't get that, or can you repeat that? I didn't understand. Whereas the second time it might elaborate that a little bit more. We're talking about colors and I didn't hear a color. And then the third time it just gives up on you. And, could say, I still didn't hear anything. I didn't hear a color. Hope you'll come back to play later.
Okay.
But notice that first one, that's not a string.
Yeah.
So that is what I call a base setting. And we're basically saying, I'm going to set some values here that will hold true for all of the rest of the possible responses until I change something. So remember we said there are other ways to kind of shortcut our conditions.
Okay.
We might set a base template with a criteria that says something that says only do this if it's been fewer than 5 times, and it applies for the rest of them. And then later on set another base criteria that says only do this if it's less than 7, and that the less than 7 applies for the following ones instead.
Okay.
So it's a way to have in a single list attached to just one resource, one response type resource, a bunch of different criteria that get evaluated in order.
All right. So it's a way of grouping items by a criteria.
Exactly.
Okay.
And a way of applying, it also lets you apply anything else, so for example, if I've got a bunch of items, all of which need to have the exact same AAPL data structure, instead of having to set that in each one, I set that in a base setting, and it gets applied to all of the following ones. In this case, I'm saying that should close should be true. So we should close after we send this response, and that's going to be true for all of the following replies. So that's a base. What I like wish I had better names in some cases. That's kind of a base template that gets applied for everything else. Okay. So the other thing that I really like using levels for is this notion of new users, novice users, and more experienced users.
Okay.
And that's really exemplified in the welcome responses. So for our most basic users, I might say, welcome to color chat. We'll be talking about colors. What's your favorite color? Whereas, once you've been around a few times, we might shorten that to welcome back to Color Chat or good to have you back. And then for even more advanced users, we could say, this is your 20th visit to Color Chat. And here I'm using a template function that's already been defined called ordinalize. Nice fancy word to say first, second, or third, but it does it for me and somebody else wrote it, so I didn't have to think about it. And also this kind of exemplifies the fact that it's taking its value from something else in the environment. So somewhere in the environment, there is this user state num visits that multivocal automatically increments for you. And it automatically increments that for you because this is something that's really common, is we want to know how often somebody's visited, so I increment it for you.
All right.
You notice this is set as a template, not as a straight string. So if we look at that, we see that there's a criteria set here. And that's that if they visited more than 10 times, we'll also include this as a possible response. So instead of just making another level, we're just going to say, 10 times. Another thing that's, we could do here is for every multiple of 10, we might, and only might, say something like, wow, this is your 10th visit, or, play the audio that has fireworks or balloons, the equivalent of your birthday events, having that as one of the possible criteria for the possible response is useful. So one of the things I kind of glossed over is, well, okay, how do we know when a user is a novice versus when they're brand new? And so, how do we define that?
Yep.
That's all done in the levels.
Ta-da!
So if we go look at the action welcome level, we can see there are two levels defined. Level 1 is defined as their number of visits exactly equals 1. And then the second level is if their number of visits is less than 5.
Okay.
And this makes it really easy to change that. But if I wanted to make it even easier, I could do something like, say, less than novice. And then over in settings, I could add a novice value. And, I might default it to 5.
Yeah.
But, now if I wanted to change that, it's just a matter of going and changing it here to, maybe we've determined that 8. We still want you to keep getting those, and it just, so this is kind of the power of having these things just in the configuration, in the settings, letting you do whatever you want wherever.
Right. That makes sense.
Okay. So we've got a lot of responses here, a lot of possible things to see. And also it handles, what do you say when you quit? I guess the next big question is, how much code is there that does this, right? So we can kind of see what happens is the user, when they show up, they'll be prompted for what's your favorite color, and they'll say a color, and it's going to respond with some message, and then it's going to prompt you for tell me another color, or what other color are you thinking about, and it'll just keep doing this and replying with colors.
Okay.
So how much code do you think this is going to take?
Well, I think I have a little bit more insight than most people.
Because you've looked at this code already.
Or I've done something similar someplace else. So I would think that, well, one, you'd have to have some code that would load the configuration. And then you would have to have some code, I don't know, call some sort of a method that says, multivocal, do your thing. And then get the response and return the response. I don't know. So
okay,
5 maybe.
It's a little bit more than that because we've also got a handler and a builder in there.
Oh, that's right. Sorry, I was thinking specifically about the.
Yep. So you're correct. We've got one line. So we've got 2 imports.
Okay.
We've got one line that loads our configuration.
Yep.
Here on 37. and one line that says, go process this.
All right. So, and that's the part that I was talking about. So what
Right.
else? And that's, if that's all you had and everything was already defined as part of like the base config, that's really all you'll need, right?
If you are doing a simple hello world, the simplest hello world in multivocal is about 4 lines long.
Okay. So that's what I was thinking.
Yep.
All right. So talk about what else we got.
So in particular, we've got a builder and a handler here.
Okay.
One of which is going to, we saw in our responses, we referred to color somewhere, and we refer to favorite color.
Okay.
Both of those are handled as part of the builder. And then we saw that we referred to an outtent in some cases, and that's being handled as part of a handler.
Okay.
And if we were doing things like, we wanted to get the hex RGB value from a call, that would also be done in the handler, but I didn't do that.
Right.
So a builder and a handler. Let's look at the builder quickly. The builder is, what is that there? About 15 lines. It takes our environment.
Okay.
It looks for a parameter named color, and that's parameter is a slot. It also then looks in our user state, what it's saved for the user's favorite color.
So, and that, since that's at the user level, that could have been in a previous session, another day, previous
Correct.
session.
Yep.
Okay.
If it doesn't find a favorite color, but it did find a color, well, obviously that was our favorite color because we're talking about it. So we'll both, so let's go save that in our environment, save that in the user state as their favorite color.
Okay.
And then we're going to store in our environment both what the color and the favorite color are. So here we've gone and taken something from a parameter and built a bunch of other values around it, saving them in the environment in various places, either in the user or in the top level of the environment to access it conveniently later.
Okay.
So that's our builder, which we registered in one line. We've also added a handler, which will only happen for the color action. An action handler for color. And handle color is in some ways even simpler. It goes and looks, what color did they set? We get that out of the environment. And we create an outtent. We save in the outtent in the environment, the string, outtent.color.whatever.
Okay.
So if in our configuration, there is an outtent.color.their_color, then it will use that. Otherwise, it's going to use probably action color or whatever. Well, yeah, action color, because that's what was triggered for this handler. And then, of course, we're going to go through the handle default, which goes back to looking at all of these localized values and picking one of them.
Okay.
And that's the code.
Wow.
So all of the stuff about what do you say the first time they join, you don't write anything. There's no code for that. It's all handled in the configuration.
Right.
If it triggers a fallback intent or, the unknown, handled in the configuration. Our code is specifically focused on places where we need to apply some kind of logic.
I have a question.
Okay.
It's comparing, I guess, 25 and 26 would be the best places to look at it.
Okay.
It actually happened up in the builder, but those are probably good enough locations. So I understand when you're setting or getting something from the environment, you're providing a path and you're getting a value back.
Yep.
An environment is the object that you're looking for that path on.
Yes. The environment is this thing that we always hand around. And we look in there for some setting. We look in there as a path.
Now, is the environment.color on 25 and wherever that is up in the builder where we actually set environment.color?
Yep.
Yeah, 17. Is that just a convenience? Is that in essence, since the environment gets rebuilt, since our conversations are stateless except for the state that we've stored. And so in essence, the pipeline that is multivocal is stateless, then because you're not like storing it at
Right.
at that level. But so is adding something to the environment at that level as opposed to adding it on a path just a shortcut for saying just the rest of this request,
Yes.
that I'm just going to stuff it here, and it's just going to go away. But if I want it to persist per a session or for the user, then I want to make sure that I put it in a location and a path.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So the environment is rebuilt every time. Every request that comes into the webhook builds a brand new environment.
Okay.
And you'll populate it. There are some things that it gets populated with that were persisted from before. So for example, user state is something that it loads on the Google platform, for example. It loads user state out of the user object that came in the request.
Okay.
On Alexa, it would have to load that in from a database somewhere.
Right.
If I saved it to session state instead in both platforms, and I think it's actually called session/state, it would get saved and then reloaded into session state the next time.
Okay.
One of the things that I could have done here, for example, is instead of just saying this convenience function obj path, that actually takes a list of paths. So this is where I could say, look for it here. And if I don't find it here, look for it somewhere else. And if I don't find it there, look for it somewhere else.
Okay. But that's typically work that work is typically done with the configuration to do those rules, but you can choose to do that there.
There is an even more convenient function, which I don't have outlined in this example, which basically says, go to the configuration at this path and return the value based on the rules that are specified there.
Okay, that makes sense.
And those rules are, look through this set of paths, picking the first one that has a value. And if you don't find it there, use this value for a default.
Okay. All right, that makes sense. So just throwing something on environment dot some value that's not one of those root values,
right?
Or not accessing it through a getter set object function. It's just a convenience.
It's actually the getter set function that is the convenience part.
Okay.
Because what this will do is, again, obj path refers to it as a path, so it's the equivalent of ? Dot.
Okay.
This line could be easily represented as env ? Dot user ? Dot state ? Dot favorite color.
I see. Okay.
They're equivalent.
All right. That clears it up. So if I had chosen down on line 17 and to call something env.user, I could mess things up.
Well, so here's the thing. One of the conventions that I've established with multivocal is any part of the path, with exceptions, there are a couple of exceptions, but any part of the path that starts with an uppercase character is reserved for multivocal.
Oh, okay.
Anything that starts with a lowercase, with a couple of exceptions, you're free to use. So if I had something user with a lowercase u, you're fine.
Okay.
User with an uppercase u, I reserve.
All right. See, this is the kind of nitty gritty that as a developer, I'm like, okay, I know what's going on now.
Right. And some of the exceptions are, usually they're exceptions where they make sense. So for example, you'll notice in here, the languages all start with lowercase, even though they're kind of reserved by the system.
Yeah.
That's because those are the standards. I mean, the standard says it's lowercase en. And I'm not going to override somebody else's standard.
Yeah, but it's usually included somewhere that's already, on a path that originally started with an uppercase. So.
Right. And they're in places where it makes sense. The other thing, of course, is that you can use uppercase. It's not that you're forbidden from using uppercase, just that multivocal defines what some of those mean. So for example, all of these response names start with uppercase.
Yeah.
But that's because I've defined that multivocal is expecting it to start with capital A action. And if you use lowercase action, it treats it as an out tent instead.
Oh, okay.
Because remember, out tents can be anything.
Yeah, that's true. Well, very cool.
So we have a little bit of time. I kind of want to address one thing that kind of illustrates something that I think is pretty cool about how some of the responses work. And I don't know how well you can see that. This is based on a message that Peter Nahn posted, responding to the episode about Sanity.io.
Oh, okay.
And basically saying he loved what you were doing, if you hadn't read it before. One of the things that he comments on is that you talked about the bot response having 3 parts. And he builds all of his stuff as having 3 parts. So responses are built of an intro or a reaction or a segue, followed by the information, followed by a question. And I saw that and I thought that was kind of amusing because multivocal has 2 parts.
Yeah.
It's got the response and the suffix. And so I thought about it for a couple of seconds and I said, well, if you really wanted to, it's not too hard to emulate that as 3 parts using multivocal. So let's see if we can quickly do that.
Okay, let's do.
So in the settings, what we would do is we would have a flex response. And the flex response targets would need to be an array. And this defines how it does that response processing.
Okay.
So which fields, instead of using the string response, what other fields is it expecting there? So first, it may look for something called, let's just call it okay, because this is where we would say, okay, just the quick response, or the quick lead in, the hook. Yeah. And then something we might call info, where we're presenting the actual info.
Okay.
And then we would build those into our actual response. So when we go back to the localized values screen, we see that it's got all of the possible things that we specified in flex response.
Okay.
So now we can, for each of these, define the possible intent, action, outtents that each one would apply to. So for example, we'll need an object here. And we could say, by default, and we need another. By default, we might say a couple of nice lead-in prompts here. So this is where we'd say, okay.
Right.
Or maybe we might say, and this one always bugs me. So, or, one that I say, I probably said 1 billion times tonight. And those would be our default kind of prompts.
And so then we would do the same thing for like the info section, or?
Yes, but a little bit different here. So for example, in info, we would have, again, we'd have an object. But here we might put in something like, this is where, action answer would be. So for so when we were handling an answer, we might come up with some replies like, obviously I don't have a handler itself, so this is kind of illustrative, but I might say, I think it is answer, or I might say, looks like answer, or,
Yeah.
I come up with
So
5 or 10.
some variations. Yeah. So,
Right. But what this also means is that for, if I had an error condition, I could again define it and say, come on, string, there we go.
okay.
Or, an additional one that says maybe didn't match, whatever. So what we then kind of want to be able to say is put them together.
Yeah.
So that, sometimes I'll have hit this error condition and sometimes I'll have an answer, but either way, I want to lead off with this, okay prompt.
Yeah.
And what we'd have in response, again, we'd need an object defining our default response. And we only need one default response in this case.
Yeah.
Because it's just going to be putting the two of them together.
It's just going to concatenate
by saying, okay, text, followed by info text.
So, you've modeled it a little bit different, but for example, if I have like intro message prompt, the prompt is already the suffix, and you just found a way to combine intro and message into response.
Yeah.
So then the response then gets concatenated together with the prompt or the suffix in your case. And so now you have a complete message. So the powerful thing in my mind to this is the fact that this is all configuration. This was a concept that you came up with later and decided to go ahead and add configuration. Those things that are already built will work the way that they are. But for those things going forward that have these three tiered responses, it's going to just work for those as well.
Right. This also,
and no code.
Exactly. This also lets us do things like, if I wanted to put in here that my default response, my all of my responses have background music to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing it using Google's SSML background music. I could put in some very complicated SSML in the response part.
Yep.
But the text fields all get determined up above, and maybe even the background music gets determined in a previous part of this.
Yeah.
So, I'd have something that, just determines and sets what background music. And that's just in this configuration section. I don't need to build code for it. I don't need to build a builder for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that I can set here as possible options.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool.
And I could even say things like, if you're thinking of something that's telling you the results of the stock market today, I can now say, okay, if the market was up, play this music. If the market is down, play this music. And that's just criteria that I build in here.
Right.
Then have some text that says what I'm talking about, and then put everything together.
Yeah.
And I think, being able to build a big message out of smaller parts that are built out of other smaller parts, none of which required a lot of code to write.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty powerful.
That is pretty powerful.
So that's kind of, I kind of hope that gives a taste of what the CMS is trying to do and how it's trying to make things easier for everybody.
Yeah.
And trying to put things together.
Yeah. And I can see like one, and this might be a developer would do a lot of setting up the configuration.
Yes.
And then have a section on the CMS where content creators are just filling in values.
Yes.
For things.
And one of the things that I kind of am aiming for with multivocal. And it's not quite there yet, but one that I'm aiming for is that all of these pages are configurable. And by configurable, I do mean in a configuration file.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
They're not all completely so.
Configuration all the way down.
It's really, I try to make configuration all the way down. So,
yeah,
this list of what shows up in settings, that's in a configuration file. If you had other settings that are important to you, you would edit the configuration file to add additional fields. And maybe you define what types those fields needed to be.
And think way into the future, kind of to the WordPress and widgets. It's like, okay, now there's a place where I can click a button and install a widget, which is really just going to be a series of configurations.
Right.
And, and a web UI to edit the content.
Right. So the other thing that kind of goes here is that right now, kind of what I'm picturing is you can write additional these kinds of pages and lay out what they look like.
Right.
And you might want to lay out a particular page that looks different. It has, a particular collection of stuff, and you've coordinated how those numbers change in relation to each other.
Right.
You write that page, you set the configuration to point to that page for this path. And it just works.
Nice.
With, for wishful thinking of just works. but that's kind of the long-term vision, is that again, as much that can be configuration is configuration, and for a couple of things that need to be code, you write the code.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my vision for where multivocal is going and where the CMS fits in. And
right.
I feel like there are a lot of things in the CMS where you kind of started to get the taste of these are predefined object types that the CMS simplifies as much as possible.
Right.
Like the template object that has, a base setting and a should close setting and criteria. Criteria is a complicated concept.
Yeah.
So I want to be able to make entry widgets that simplify that as much as possible. Can't completely do so, but I feel like it can be a hell of a lot easier than it is now.
Yeah. It's a start though. This is, what is it, a month ago? I can't remember when we started. There was no UI to multivocal, right? So
there was no, this is purely you can do this. But there's really, I hope this gave people a taste for both what multivocal is and why it's so powerful.
Yep.
And then starting to see the UI that will help you really unleash that power.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. Well, thank you for showing us a tour. Today was under the hood of what it takes to set up configuration with a web UI, as well as what code, the less than 50 lines of code to create your starter project and add a builder and a handler, and just kind of how everything fits together. So
I really want to hear feedback on it. Peter's feedback, for example, told me I was kind of on the right track of response and suffix, but also said, what else can be done? How can we do this better in some cases? And I think we've illustrated that there are certainly ways that we can mimic that and empower you to do that.
Well, and what's interesting is with a content management system, we're showing that you can set up a lot of stuff outside of code. Not say that this is a no code tool. And I'm definitely not knocking no code tools. I've got respect for a number of ones that are out there.
But they're hard.
It's hard to build and maintain, and as things change, like new platforms to write assistants and apps for, it just gets more complicated, and something like this pushes more of not necessarily the burden or work, but more of the choices and the flexibility outside of the code, where things can, be changed quickly or experimented upon
Yeah.
and things without involving any of the code changes and the
No,
time and expense required for that.
that's an excellent point. So thank you for indulging me with this. This has been a fun exploration.
Yeah.
And you've been invaluable in helping shape some of the ideas that I have been going into some of this. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate others. I really am looking forward to more feedback on this as we move forward.
And we can talk about that in your office hours or on social media or on a future version of Two Voice Devs.
Two Voice Devs. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again, Mark. Have a good week.
You're welcome. Yep, you too. Take care.